grunge explosion of the early 90s was responsible for the creation of some of the most influential, incendiary, and iconic acts in rock music. Managing to endure the storm that saw many fall by the wayside, Pearl Jam, fronted by the darkly charismatic Eddie Vedder, bucked the mainstream trend and succeeded to be recognized as much more than just a representation of the movement from which they emerged. With their intense sound, haunting lyrics, and raw aggression, they have transcended the grunge scene to cement their place as one of America's greatest rock bands.
Pearl Jam's particular genius and their particular burden was to come along at a time when they could charge forward and summarize the past at the same moment. And believe me, they were tarred and feathered by punk rock kids for actually caring about how music sounded.
This sort of goes back to maybe the grunge tag, that was Pearl Jam even grunge at all. And, you know, now I just think of it as sort of vintage rock and roll. You know, it's much more of a akin to the Stones and, you know, the Beatles and Jeff Beck and, you know, all those Cream and all that stuff, which is, they're heroes too. So, you know, if they're the ones holding the torch for a good old honest rock and roll, you know, I think they've certainly helped maintain that standard of, you know, honesty.
They have definitely found this place where they are tremendously well respected. There's probably no band in America who is more respected by fans and by other musicians, certainly, than Pearl Jam.
Pearl Jam is one of the most important bands of the last 2 decades in American music. You know, there were a number of bands that came out of Seattle in the 90s: Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, and Pearl Jam. What's remarkable about Pearl Jam is 20-some years after their beginning, they're still around. And in fact, of all those bands that began in that era, they're the only band that's still around.
They combine a lot of elements that are appealing to the American people. We've got the classic rock influences, there's guitar solos, and yet at the same time, you've got the great lyrics and the poetic side of a sort of a Dylan or a Springsteen, with Eddie bringing that to the table. They've never sold out, they've never used media tricks, there's been a bit of mystery about the band, and they've continued to tour and play live, and, you know, people will always be looking to see what this band are going to do next.
Eddie Vedder was a long way from his native Evanston, Illinois, when he joined forces with Stone Gossard, Jeff Ament, Mike McCready, and Dave Crewson in Seattle to form Pearl Jam in 1990. As just another band from a scene that had been slowly building in the Pacific Northwest towards the end of the 80s that would come to be known as grunge, Pearl Jam were one of many acts fighting to be heard amongst the feedback scream of the Seattle sound. They would go on to spearhead the movement, along with fellow groups such as Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains. The rise of the alternative generation as the decade drew to a close heralded a new approach to rock music in the region, one that threw out the glitz and glamour of LA arena rock and brought in something that was not only aware of its roots, but that felt more aggressive, nihilistic, and raw.
The importance about Seattle as a scene is that it can't be seen as something that was invented out of nowhere in fall of 1991 when you had Nirvana and Soundgarden and Pearl Jam all releasing albums within the space of a few weeks of each other, essentially. It wasn't like everyone woke up one day in Seattle and said, oh, let's invent grunge. Rather, what you have is a scene that is all over the place. It's a whole bunch of people working in a particular vein that over time, the most successful, the most well-known approaches will be seen to stand for the whole.
Grunge was like-minded musicians who came from Seattle or the Seattle area, who valued punk rock, but they also valued very sludgy, heavy, hard rock from the 70s. So if you took that punk ethos and crossed it with Black Sabbath, you'd have something like grunge.
In the late 80s, the music scene in Seattle was extremely quiet, backwater. No band had any chance of breaking out of here, it felt like, at that point, and getting success anywhere beyond the Pacific Northwest. At that time, playing to 100 people was kind of what the big time was. Nobody thought that there was a chance for success beyond that small, sleepy, quiet club scene. I think as a result, people began to think of recording records as kind of the goal. And those records did better than anyone expected. It was the success of the records made by the bands of Seattle that made the Seattle music scene.
Drawing influences from hardcore punk and metal as well as indie rock, the movement slowly built, and with it so did the industry around the bands. One notable contributor to the scene was the small independent label Sub Pop, started by Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman in 1986. With the release of their seminal Deep Six compilation album, they provided a needed outlet for many of the emerging acts that soon signed to the label. These included bands such as Malfunction, Soundgarden, and the first seeds of Pearl Jam, Green River.
Well, Green River consisted of Mark Arm, the singer. Then you also had Jeff Ament, the bassist, and also Stone Gossard, the guitarist, and those are the three main guys that people tend to know. And that was a band that you can compare to the Stooges maybe a little bit as far as Mark Arm's Iggy Pop type stage persona. He was very confrontational. Didn't think twice about jumping into the audience. And as far as musically, you had two factions. You had Mark Arm that was more into the Stooges. Then you had Jeff and Stone that were maybe more into Kiss and more mainstream, I think, than what Mark Arm was probably listening to and what his idea of a band would be. There's a story that Jeff Ament tells that they were, I think in 1988, or a little bit earlier, maybe 87, they were in California, and they saw a performance by Jane's Addiction, and Stone and Jeff were blown away by them, thinking that they were great, and Mark thought that they just sucked. And Jeff said at that point he realized that him and Stone just differed too much from Mark, and shortly thereafter, they split up. And then from there, Mark went on to do Mudhoney, which is a great band. And Jeff and Stone formed Mother Love Bone.
Gossard and Ament joined with charismatic Malfunction lead singer Andrew Wood, along with Greg Gilmore on drums and fellow Green River member Bruce Fairweather, to form the band Mother Love Bone in 1988.
It was just kind of destiny. I couldn't find my band that I wanted to be in. Green River broke up right at the right time, and they were the guys I needed to be in the band that I wanted to form.
With a musical flavour that was inspired more by the 70s rock sounds that had caused the split in Green River, Mother Love Bone was looking to take the Seattle music scene by storm.
I think a lot of us grew up listening to, Black Sabbath or Aerosmith and Kiss and stuff, and I think a lot of us got into the punk thing because from a playing standpoint, we could relate more to the Ramones or something, it was, you could play along to Blitzkrieg Bop, you couldn't play along to Nobody's Fault or something like that.
Mother Love Bone was a great band. I saw them on a number of occasions, and they're a vastly underrated band, partially because their record, I think, doesn't capture the excitement that Andrew Wood had as a live performer. Of anybody that you met in the Seattle music scene in the mid-'80s, he was someone that was just full of life, a wonderful human being, very charming, and a great charismatic frontman.
And Andy Wood was the complete opposite of Mark Arm. He was more into Kiss and all the arena rock bands, like Steven Tyler, Elton John, he was even a fan of. So he meshed well with their kind of thought, their kind of thought of what a band should be.
there's, I mean, a heavy glam influence. I mean, you know, you look at Andrew Wood and you think, well, that guy clearly loves Freddie Mercury. But it wasn't quite the same kind of glam that you heard in Poison and Motley Crue and the sort of, you know, dominant metal bands of that era, you know, that grunge supposedly killed off. Even for Seattle at the time, it was a pretty big sound, and that group also made no bones about the fact that, like, they wanted to become a big band. Like, they never wanted to be Mark Arm. Like, they never just sort of wanted to have a group that sounded kind of scuzzy, and that was fine. You know, they definitely had goals, and so that immediately set them apart as well. You know, because being careerist in Seattle in 1990 was like this, you know, just this. That was madness. You know, that was how you got banned from the Crocodile Cafe.
At that point in Seattle, that was something that you'd never admitted to. It was considered in poor taste to admit to the fact that you wanted to be stars. Now, it's certainly true that everybody wanted to be stars. You know, everyone wanted attention, but they kind of wanted it on their own terms.
Having made their rock star intentions very clear, Mother Love Bone was fast becoming a success on the Seattle scene and attracted attention from several major labels, eventually signing to Polygram subsidiary Mercury Records, on which they released their debut EP, Shine, in March 1989. The following year, in March 1990, with the world seemingly at the feet of this new band, and with less than a week before their first album, Apple, was to see the light of day, lead singer Andy Wood died in hospital following a heroin overdose at the age of 24. Wood's death was a massive blow to the burgeoning Seattle music scene, and also halted immediately any further activity from Mother Love Bone, which in turn paved the way for the birth of the band that was to become Pearl Jam.
Now, Andrew Wood is very important in terms of Pearl Jam for a very simple reason. If he hadn't passed, Pearl Jam would not exist. And the problem with that is it makes it sound like that, you know, he had to die, which is a ridiculous idea. I'm sure anybody would tell you it's like, no, they'd much rather have him around. Pearl Jam is something that was grew out of a tragic accident and then became its own thing from there.
Following Mother Love Bone's demise and still reeling from the sudden death of Andy Wood, both Jeff Ament and Stone Gossard began picking up the pieces of their music careers. Joining forces with another Seattle guitarist, Mike McCready, whose band Shadow had recently parted ways, they set about forming a new band and recording some demos in order to bring in a singer and a drummer for their project. A copy of the demos eventually found its way into the hands of the now San Diego-based Eddie Vedder.
The thing with someone like Eddie Vedder is you have another case of a sort of a classic American upbringing that's almost a stereotype in some eyes, and that's not to belittle him. Rather, it's one of those things that, especially at the time, it was seen to be almost a classic story of somebody who had, you know, struggles at home, a broken family, trying to make his own way, and taking comfort in music. He's a working stiff. He's a security guard. He's down in San Diego. He's playing basketball with his buddies. He's performing in bands. One of his basketball buddies is a guy named Jack Irons, who, of course, has already tasted some success thanks to his work in the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Jack Irons passes on this demo tape that he gets from Stone Gossard and Jeff Ament, who are looking for a drummer and a singer.
Vedder, the legend goes, listened to the music before surfing, came up with lyrics, went up to Seattle, was in the band, and really came to define the band over time, even though he was pretty much the last guy in.
In the beginning, when they brought Eddie in, he'd never really fronted a band before. You know, he hadn't had a whole lot of experience sort of commanding a stage or even writing lyrics all that much. Like, he had written things, but he'd never really, you know, he had journals, but hadn't put a ton of it to music. And it was also, you know, you had 4 guys from Seattle, and then this dude from San Diego who liked surfing and was sort of into the earth and the ocean, and, you know, and it kind of had that vibe about it.
The band clicks right around the same time that the Temple of the Dog project is being recorded. So that enables Vedder to start working in a full-on studio setting with not merely Stone Gossard and Jeff Ament, but Chris Cornell as well, and get some sort of further recording experience under his belt. And they start playing around and playing out. And the big advantage, too, is that if it had been Eddie Vedder fronting a band and getting some major label attention, well, maybe some of those initial missteps, you could say, that maybe every band must inevitably do at the start, would have been more of a problem later on, because it's a case where it's sort of like, okay, here's the rock world, and what am I going to do with it? How am I working here? But he's got the support of a couple of guys who have already been through everything. They have already been through everything. They've been through working on minor labels. They've been working on indie labels. They've been working on major labels. They've been signed. They've toured, and they have suffered an ultimate blow in not merely the band breaking up, but band breaking up due to the death of a frontman. Almost everything you could say packed into a few years' space, but they are already grizzled veterans in a weird sort of way. And because of that, you have a sort of support team that kind of already knows some of the drill.
It ended up being this sort of perfect fit because I think he came from, he was obviously a big fan of the type of hard rock that the Mother Love Bone dudes were doing, but he was also really interested in the more punk aspect of it, the more kind of egalitarian, real kind of DIY aspect that the guys from Green River were. So he really kind of ended up being the keystone that held the rest of the group together.
With drummer Dave Cruson completing the lineup, the band, operating under the name of their favorite basketball player, Mookie Blaylock, was ready to begin work and played its first show in Seattle in October 1990. Drawing on their Mother Love Bone experience, Jeff and Stone brought in their contact at Polygram, Michael Goldston, to help them get a deal. Unlike many new bands on the Seattle scene, they signed to major label Epic Records that year. In the spring of '91, the band, now called Pearl Jam due to trademark concerns regarding the use of Blaylock's name, went to the local London Bridge studios, where they recorded their seminal album, 10, in just over 3 weeks.
When I spoke with Jeff, he mentioned that when they found Eddie for their debut album 10, they wanted to do the complete opposite of what they were doing with Mother Love Bone with their full-length debut, Apple. They wanted to not spend as much time, because with Apple, they spent way, way too long. It was too much thought out. With 10, they wanted to be just right back to basics, very quick. They just wanted to get everything, I think, back on a smaller level. And as a result, it's definitely more stripped down and even more punky than that, you could say.
I think that this plays again into the London Bridge, is that it's a bigger studio and it has all these windows and everything. So you can set up that way where everyone's playing in the room with headphones, but all the instruments are isolated. So I know that was sort of a shift too. Even the way studios were designed in the 80s, even out of the 70s, people were designing these tight, small, carpeted studios, where this studio, London Bridge, was designed after some of these bigger, famous London studios with all the brick and the hardwood. So I think that actually played into some of the Seattle sound as well. And maybe the vibe, too, of playing together live, like you would in a rehearsal room.
When Pearl Jam made 10, this obviously its release predated Nevermind. So as far as I was concerned, anyway, there wasn't the Seattle sound. When I was working on the Tin Machine record with David Bowie, he was very influenced by bands like the Pixies and Sonic Youth. And, his album with Tin Machine was grungy, although it really didn't define how the sound became. But I think once the bands find their feet and their music, the sound sort of comes together. And I don't think 10 necessarily represented the majority of the grunge sound, but it certainly, from a musical standpoint, was the beginning of that path.
Of 10 in August '91 was a very low-key affair, with Pearl Jam being just another new band from the Seattle scene. However, the timing proved to be significant. Nirvana's Nevermind album, issued in September, thrust the grunge sound into the mainstream and heralded the arrival of a new breed of rock music. 10 supported this and started to gain steady momentum across America.
It's often overlooked that within the same span of a few months, you had 10 and Nevermind, but also Guns N' Roses' Use Your Illusion records, which were, if that isn't sort of a metaphor for the death knell of American rock, at the time, and that sort of symbolism for that transition, then I have no idea what is. Obviously, the thing that 10 had going for it was it had these gigantic singles that sounded amazing on the radio. Like, I know that when they went back and remastered that record, they kind of switched around the production a little bit, and it's debatable whether or not it actually improves it. But I think, to me, and obviously you'd never know this because who would broadcast those songs on radio now, but I have a feeling that the new production would sound less good coming through, you know, a transistor radio in 1991.
When people look at 10, one thing that's important to remember is that 10 broke as an album, not in Seattle. It broke across the United States through FM radio stations, essentially at the same time, and through MTV videos. They had a huge role in making that record a hit.
It sounds like classic rock radio and became classic rock radio. It sounds like something that had a lot of stuff on it that was easygoing and yet had some passion to it. It was something that it sounded good. It was mixed to sound good. It was mixed to sound like something that you could just put on, just imagine yourself just listening to in hallways, driving around in your car, doing whatever.
When we mixed that record, the music at the time was still very rock-driven. There was still a lot of bands like your Tesla and Warrant and all those sort of things around. So nobody was afraid of things like reverb and making things sound big. Later, the grunge sound became more about being honest and dry and natural. So when I was mixing 10, I wasn't really afraid to use all the colors that were available to me. And when I heard the music, I really wanted it to be a deep, emotive sound because I felt that there was a lot going on in that music that could be brought out. And because it was very much a performance recording, there was a lot of room to try reverse reverb or a delay here or a reverb there. And that was my intention.
The thing that made them great immediately and that attracted people to them immediately was that, you know, you heard the opening riff to Alive, and it sounded simultaneously like it was something fresh and totally new and, you know, and totally great and anthemic, but it also sounded like it could be a classic rock song. Like it sounded like something that was also comfortable and familiar and, you know, something that you could play, spot the influence, and you kind of knew where it was coming from. I think that's why rock fans felt better about getting behind Pearl Jam, because it felt like a smoother transition than something as abrasive as Nevermind.
Story for you. What you thought was your daddy was nothing but
The thing with not only Pearl Jam, but all those grunge bands at the time, again, they were a complete reaction to what was prevalent prior to them. You know, your Guns N' Roses type bands. They, I think, were a little more gritty and weren't afraid to speak their mind. They were a little more thought-provoking with their lyrics. And it was, I think, why it became so popular, the whole grunge thing. A lot of the younger music fans, and they could really relate to what Eddie Vedder was saying, and also what Kurt Cobain was saying, and also Chris Cornell.
Because it's music being used as a vehicle for something where you have a sense of a band really playing together, a sense of a band actually just, you know, going out and just, you know, hey man, this is real, this is us. This whole idea of the image on the front cover, of them all just sort of like, we're a unit, we're doing this, that whole thing, this whole ethos, it's one of those things that it can strike people almost as false because it seems too good to be true. It seems like, okay, it's almost like the, yeah, you know, us against the world, here we all are, this is what I'm saying from my heart.
And I think that music fans could relate to that more than, say, your Vince Neils of the world or whoever, you know, where it's a guy traveling around in a limo. You know, there's such a difference between him up on a stage and, say, like, you know, Kurt Cobain or, like, you know, Eddie Vedder, who could just be a guy who was waiting in line to go see a Black Flag show.
sorry I didn't see him, but I'm glad we talked. Oh, I'm still alive. Yeah. I'm still alive. Yeah. I'm still alive.
The thing about many of those songs from 10, but particularly Alive, is we didn't really know what it was about. And this is the way most music works. It is defined by your experience of it, not necessarily the songwriter's experience of it. But in this case, the particular biographical dimensions of Alive would remain shrouded for years. It was a very personal, very intense, very pointed song by Eddie Vedder, who had grown up believing that a man who he would find out was his stepfather was his biological father. And in point of fact, he'd met his biological father, didn't know that he was anything other than a friend of the family. The song is a lament in anthem form.
He was able to put these images, these thoughts, these stories into something that actually struck a chord. And he was able to do so in a way that both drew on his own experiences, and he's been very open about which songs in particular have been the most autobiographical. Alive is a very good example. And he's also been able to draw them on experiences of others. Jeremy is another classic example from that album, of things that had happened in life, tragic situations. Melodramatic? They can be, so a lot of the songs are, but he found a vehicle that satisfies him to be able to get these thoughts out, these things that he's been working on for years.
The combination of Vedder's poetic, observational and biographical lyrics, combined with the old-school rock edge of Gossard and Ament's music, helped Ten gain a vital foothold across the United States. With drummer Dave Crewson being replaced by Dave Abruzzese, Pearl Jam's success was steadily building as they set out on their supporting tour. Although singles from the album were not being released domestically, both Alive and Even Flow were met with steady commercial and critical success overseas. At home, despite strong interest, the public, and most importantly, members of the Seattle music fraternity, greeted Pearl Jam with caution, some unsure as to whether they would be able to sustain such an initial impact, while others began to question their legitimacy as an authentic grunge act.
You know, to be perfectly honest, at the time, 10 was a very, very difficult album to understand. It's an album that explained itself on the radio, song by song, when it arrived as an album from a band I'd never heard of because I was in New York. I didn't know who, really? They're not one of the Seattle bands I heard of. And you know, you had heard of other bands. It's not just that Nirvana had put out a record beforehand. They toured relentlessly leading up to Nevermind. And I had a Nirvana album at home. I had 7-inch singles by Nirvana at home. I'd seen Soundgarden probably a half a dozen times. But in the mail, this record comes by Pearl Jam. Doesn't sound like a very grungy punk name. Didn't sound like a very grungy punk band. Didn't really cohere for me.
It was a big album in Seattle. It definitely sold a lot in Seattle, but it wasn't like Seattle made that band. And some of these other bands out of this area, Seattle made them a star to start with. With Pearl Jam, there almost was a reaction within Seattle because it was like they became big without our blessing.
They made a big mistake. They didn't go further and find more of the bands that were already here and had been here even before the bands that were exploited were. You know, that's what it makes me feel guilty of the success of our band, because it should have been spread out to the success of like a number of bands here.
They became so big so fast that they outran Seattle's support in it to a degree. And I think that explains a little bit of the odd relationship Seattle and other members of Seattle bands always had with Pearl Jam.
One of the most notable criticisms to be aimed at Pearl Jam came from Nirvana's Kurt Cobain, who called the band a commercial sellout, and this led to a reported feud between the two frontmen.
The feud between Eddie Vedder and Kurt Cobain that got written up in a few magazines and got a lot of attention really wasn't a feud. Basically what happened was that Kurt Cobain said a couple of things to a couple of journalists in a couple of interviews about how he thought maybe Pearl Jam were careerists, was the term that he used. And I think Cobain's attack of Pearl Jam had less to do with Pearl Jam and more about Kurt wanting to position himself. He was just as much a careerist as Eddie Vedder. He wanted to be successful. He made a video for MTV. He made an album. He released an album on a major label, and he was ecstatic that it sold as many copies as it did, at least early on. But he felt that by criticizing Pearl Jam and saying, they're more careerist than I am, that he could then kind of reclaim some indie cred himself. In truth, Pearl Jam were a target. They were a band that came off and shot for the stars from the beginning. They played arenas. They made some videos, and they also, occasionally in interviews, came off maybe as a tad arrogant. But all that could be said for Cobain as well. But I think it was more a feud that was created by Kurt simply to position himself. It had less to do with any true animosity between the two men.
I was asking Jeff Ament about it, and he was saying that the press really kind of had a lot to do with that, that at the time Pearl Jam was exploding, Nirvana was exploding, and it was just a matter of reporters maybe going to Kurt Cobain with 50 Pearl Jam questions, and they'd go to Pearl Jam with 50 Nirvana questions. It was just kind of a war that way. It wasn't really that the bands didn't get along.
But there is an incident which I write about in Heavier Than Heaven, which is truly a very, very beautiful scene, if you can imagine this happening. And it happens at the 1992 MTV Music Awards, where, you know, already this animosity has happened. Kurt has said a couple things, and the media has really blown it out of proportion. And there was a point that didn't get captured on tape, but I've talked to a number of people who witnessed it, where Kurt and Eddie actually had this brief little slow dance together, where they sort of joined each other and they did this little trot around the dance floor. And that intimacy is really a very beautiful image. If Kurt Cobain hated Eddie Vedder, there's no way on earth he would have done that. He never slow danced with Axl Rose, put it that way. What is true, though, is that behind the scenes, after both men became famous, they did, in a way, become friends. They had a number of times that they met privately, and there was, I think, a respect that happened between the two bands. In a way, they both had a similar story. They both became huge stars very quickly, and I think the demands of fame overwhelmed them. So there were probably more similarities between Eddie and Kurt, I think, than either were wanting to admit at the time.
Regardless of the criticism that came their way, Pearl Jam's star continued to rise. Midway through '92, despite having been on sale for almost a year, 10 was experiencing its full breakthrough. Pearl Jam began to gain massive exposure on radio and television, appearing on Saturday Night Live and performing an acoustic set on MTV for their Unplugged series. As the grunge explosion continued, the pressures of touring and fame were soon starting to build on the band. With the release of their third single, Jeremy, Pearl Jam, unhappy with the overplay on MTV, stumbled into a controversy regarding the interpretation of the video. As a result, they took the bold step to withdraw from making promotional videos altogether.
The whole Jeremy situation was a very bizarre little perfect storm. Obviously, the record had already been, become this pretty big thing. The Alive and Even Flow singles had already been, become staples on modern rock radio. Jeremy comes out, that becomes gigantic, but then it also ends up getting this weird backlash from people. Not only from people who, thought that the band was getting too big or, whatever else, but also from you know, the same sort of conservatives who you know, don't like to see violence anywhere, and there was all this confusion about what happens at the end of the video. There was a large contingent of people who thought that the end of the video meant that Jeremy went to the front of the classroom and executed his entire class. When you know, it's fairly obvious when you actually look at it that he's actually killing himself, and that's where the sort of blood splatter comes from. That was the thing that sort of been like, well, this has now gotten too far, and it sort of flipped the switch in their brain. And that combined with that first 18 months or so, I mean, they put out 2 records and did a ridiculous number of tour dates and played the VMAs and had all this other attention for stuff. It's like, you know, so by the time it came around to that, they did something that I don't think any band has ever done in history, and they consciously decided to be smaller.
At home, drawing pictures of mountain tops with him on top, lemon yellow sun, arms raising a beam, the dead lay in pools of maroon below. Daddy didn't give attention, oh, to the fact that mommy didn't care. King down on me, the wicked, oh, ruled his world. Jeremy spoken yesterday. Jeremy spoken yesterday.
To come out and publicly criticize MTV and to say we're not going to make any more music videos. There was no band as popular as Pearl Jam at that point who walked away from making music videos. Remember Nirvana, a band that always had, to some degree, more critical cred than Pearl Jam. Kurt Cobain was still greatly in incredible detail planning what the music video for Heart-Shaped Box would be. That was something he was very involved in, and he still saw that as a viable way. But Eddie Vedder, around that same time, said, I don't want to be in a music video anymore. And they stopped making them. And that issue forever will be linked to Pearl Jam.
Now, if you're a young band who has middling success, you're just sort of like, you know, you've done a national tour or two, you got some attention, you're not going to have this cachet, you're not going to have this relative clout. You are, however, Pearl Jam with 10, who has scored this massive commercial success, and you can say, like, nope, sorry, no, we don't want to do this. And what is the band's label going to do? What are they going to say? Are they going to say, well, we need more publicity for you out there? They didn't need more publicity at that point. Everyone already knew who they were. By the end of '92, you got to the point where they had been parodied on Saturday Night Live, where they were sort of appearing on more covers. They were just, you know, people knew who they were. They had already gotten over that introduce Pearl Jam to the world thing. That had happened.
Pearl Jam had indeed been introduced to the world. The surprise global success of 10 left the Seattle Rockers with a fairly arduous task in creating a follow-up album that could meet the expectations of their adoring fans, yet also appease their peers from the now flourishing Seattle music scene. In the spring of 1993, Pearl Jam, now music superstars, were taken to Plush Studios, The Site, in Northern California. Only a stone's throw away from George Lucas's Skywalker Ranch, it was a venue that reflected the band's commercial success of the past 2 years. However, this troubled the already burdened Vedder, who was showing increasing signs of difficulty dealing with his newfound hero status and idolization.
Eddie was not happy at all with the surroundings of the studio that they recorded Verses at, that they rented out a beautiful, nice, scenic place in California. And he didn't want that at all. He wanted just something, you know, just the complete opposite. And to get back in the right frame of mind, he would go in his truck and travel to, I believe, San Francisco, and would just sleep in his truck overnight and would just mingle with people just walking around the area, whether it be junkies or just people walking around, just try to get some kind of different kind of thought process or something to fuel his creativity for songwriting.
I think what was hard for Pearl Jam by the time of the second record is that the first record came from nowhere. There were no expectations. No one knew who Eddie Vedder was. The day that 10 was released, there were 60 people who were waiting for Eddie Vedder's album, and they were all his relatives, or the handful of people who'd seen one of the off-ramp shows. You know, there was not crowd demanding, we want our Eddie Vedder songs. But by the time of the second record, there were such expectations on Eddie that I think it became increasingly difficult for him. He truly had to perform. He had now a reputation to live up to. He had a standard that he had set. And I think he was tormented to a degree. He wrote some great songs when he was tormented, but I also think that we go a few records later than that, he finally starts to bring the other band members in and basically says, I give up. I need other people to write songs. I can't do it all myself anymore.
Vedder was someone who was tortured by fame in ways that seemed both necessary and unnecessary. And the particular way that he dealt with it was to withdraw. At that time, that worked. This was a path blazed by Kurt Cobain. Refusal became something that the mass audience wanted out of its icons at that time. For Vedder, the path wasn't just blazed by Cobain, though that was the most obvious of the trailblazers at the time. It was also blazed by people like Neil Young. Neil Young, who had become a titanically important artistic figure and also an important commercial figure by being weird and by refusing to play by anybody else's rules. And to Vedder and to Pearl Jam, Young would become sort of a lighthouse keeper. He was the one who showed them the way.
She lives in the TV sky. She lives in such pain. She rides in a bulletproof stretch limousine. The smoke in the barroom nights, faces in her window, the sound of the harbor horn she recognized. And when the music started, she just slipped away. It's like a river rolling down. And when the music started, she just slipped away. She just slipped away.
For Vedder, instead of explaining who he was, he refused to explain who he was, where he had come from, what his songs meant. All of this was a way of withholding from the audience that made the audience only want him more. It became a kind of perverse dance.
Despite Vedder's objections, the band pressed on. Producer Brendan O'Brien had been brought in, and it was his goal to create an album with a more authentic live flavour.
I think that one of the great shifts for Pearl Jam is finding Brendan O'Brien, because he is the sort of, well, I don't know, fifth member is exactly the fair assessment, but he's the following that old sawhorse, he's the fifth Beatle when it comes to Pearl Jam, because he has been very essential to capturing their sound. Once he became, their producer, engineer, whatever you want to call him, he brought in more of a live sound to Pearl Jam.
Brendan's a guitar player, and he gets right to the root of what they're trying to do, and I think that as a musician he has given them their sound and kept it natural and raw, and I think that some other producers may have tried to force a sort of more developed, produced sound on them, and Brendan hasn't done that.
All their records that he worked on sounded better. They sounded raw, they jumped off of the album more, and there was a huge shift, I think, between 10 and when Brendan came in.
Versus was released in October '93 to high anticipation. Featuring a raw aesthetic and a less produced feel, it was an instant critical success, but commercially the album proved to be a monster. With 10 still riding high in the charts, having now outsold Nirvana's Nevermind, Versus recorded sales figures just shy of 1 million copies within its first week, making it the fastest-selling album the world had seen.
Versus is an astonishing album in many ways, just because of something that, the band would probably, almost hate to have to talk about, but it's true. The smash commercial success of it. It was just a ridiculously huge selling album out of the gate. When the actual figures were announced, and it was almost literally 1 million copies, I mean, that was just something that, you know, people's jaws were dropping.
But it also was sort of interesting and ironic because, you know, for a record that sold as big as it did, it's an extremely raw album. I mean, you can already hear hints of the sound that they were kind of morphing into. I mean, it has rarely any of that slickness that's on 10. There's a lot of jagged edges, and it sounds really claustrophobic. I mean, it's very clearly a record full of songs written on the road and, you know, in the midst of turmoil.
The fun part, though, was that it was something that the band seemed to be happy with and the fans seemed to be happy with. At the same time, it's one of those things where you saw the potential future of the band that they then turned away from. That's the importance of Versus. You have an album that has another slew of hits that appear on the radio with incredible frequency. Go, the first single, of course. You have Daughter, you have Dissident, and you have other tracks that get a lot of airplay, and everyone, again, is really into this. Now, again, it's not a case that no one's being blindsided by this anymore. People know what to expect, and there's this idea, this overwhelming idea, that has now been constructed around what the band has done, and around especially what Vedder has done as a frontman, that here speaks the truth.
Versus is much, much more of a punk rock record than 10 is. Much more of a punk rock. I remember putting it on the moment I got it and thinking, God, you can't do that. You can't play a straight-up hardcore punk bass line on a major label record that's #1 in the country. That's not allowed. Who does that? You know, I mean, in certain ways, it was more straight-up punk rock than Nirvana was.
And I think Versus is a very apt title because that's them just reacting to forces from the outside. I've always found it great that they were originally going to call the record 5 Against 1 because I always took that idea to mean, well, we are one band versus, you know, whatever else is on the outside world, and we are being overwhelmed. And so those songs end up being this really sort of interesting cycle of, you know, just them sort of flailing and fighting back, but doing it in the, you know, sort of most, you know, rockin' loudest way possible.
But at the same time, you have a case where the band had gotten so good at what it already had done that you listen to it sometimes and you almost think, if they had stayed on this route, they might not be around anymore. This might have just simply been the first of many sequels to 10, which would have just been 10 all over again. To a large extent, not to a complete extent, but to a large extent, that is what Versus is. You hear a song like Dissident, and it's almost overly familiar in terms of being Alive Part 2. That's a bit of a stretch, but it's not completely untrue.
She nursed him there for a night. Wasn't so sure she wanted him to stay. What to say, what to say. Soon she was down, soon he was low. And I caught her fast, only know she had to turn around. When she couldn't hold on, she falling. This is it, this is screaming whenever the same as bad. Oh, this is it, this is it, this is
It wasn't their fully integrated record yet. It was the record I think they felt they had to make, the record that they could make then because they'd gotten their legs under them as a live band, an extremely important difference between the first and second Pearl Jam records. At the time of the first record, they're basically a backup band for two guitarists. At the time of the second record, they're a working band.
You do have a sense that the band sound that they had, worked on, they had developed in rehearsals, that they had released on 10, and then turned out to be something that would be a huge success, was something that they could start to do very easily, and almost too easily. At the same time, no one's questioning the fact that their passion for the music is unchanged. No one's questioning the fact that Eddie Vedder is still somebody who comes up with turns of phrase, with the ability to have this voice that people respond to, that people really like and appreciate. Again, it's also an easily parodied voice, but it is nonetheless a recognizable, strong voice. That the band are able to create songs that are something that's, melodies, things that were played on the radio, go down well. It sounds good.
Well, I do think there's a storytelling element that Eddie began to explore more by the second album. Certainly Jeremy and some of the songs on the first album are little vignettes, but he was more willing with songs like Daughter or Elderly Woman. He was willing to kind of write, maybe it's not fair to call it a Raymond Carver short story because it's not as fleshed out as that, but it's a very finely constructed moment in time that he's trying to capture there.
Alone, listless, breakfast table and otherwise empty room. Young girl, violins, center of her own attentions. Or mother reads aloud, child tries to understand it, tries to make her proud.
This was a unique time in rock and roll, never before and never since, really. Had men so successfully talked about the problems of, being men. Or in rock and roll, that doesn't usually happen. Or so successfully advanced the idea that, hey, you know what, women have something to say too. So the idea of daughter, yeah, don't call me daughter, this is a kind of feminist sentiment. It is a different kind of song. That kind of ballad was not a very grunge kind of ballad. That was more a Zeppelin 3 kind of acoustic ballad.
The shades go down, it's in her head. Painted room, can't deny something wrong. Don't call me, don't nothing to. The picture kept will remind me. Don't call me, don't nothing to. The picture kept will remind me.
I think Eddie as a writer finally came to his own. He wrote great anthems on the first album, but in my opinion as a music critic, I'm not sure that those songs will stand the test of time. They stand the test of commercial success. There'll be linchpins for that. But I think Eddie as a writer got much better. He focused and I think spent more effort on the lyrics of the second record. And, he's become he understood music more. He's become a much, much better songwriter as time has gone by.
The release and subsequent success of Verses not only validated Pearl Jam's credentials as one of the leading acts in the industry at the time, but also demonstrated the potential of the band. Once again partaking in a grueling tour schedule in support of the album, Pearl Jam's achievements appeared even more remarkable due to their lack of extra promotion, as not only were they refusing to make music videos, but they were now becoming increasingly more reclusive when it came to press interviews, preferring to deliver their music directly to their fans at shows. By the spring of 1994, grunge was well and truly a global phenomenon. It was not only Pearl Jam and Nirvana reaping massive success, but other acts such as Soundgarden, whose Super Unknown album had broken them into the mainstream. Grunge clothing had become the fashion, and Seattle the birthing ground for 1,000 different acts, all vying to be the next big thing. However, reality suddenly hit home hard when the news broke on April the 8th that Kurt Cobain, Nirvana lead singer and idol to so many music fans around the world, had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. It was an event that affected many and came as a severe blow to the grunge movement.
When Kurt committed suicide, it was like the air went out of the balloon of Seattle in so many ways. The expectations had been so high and so many bands were doing so well, but Kurt's death gave us an appreciation and understanding that all along there had been a dark side to this, that this phenomenal success we were seeing would not continue. And what's interesting is that it's the year after Kurt's death that Pearl Jam find huge success, that Soundgarden finally really break through, that Alice in Chains have one of their biggest years. So the commercial juggernaut of the Seattle scene still continues. But I think knowing and having interviewed almost all the guys that were in the bands that were left in that era, everybody felt deflated and depressed by Kurt's death.
The effects of Cobain's death were far-reaching. But for Eddie Vedder, they were particularly personal, as he had lost the only other individual who understood the pressures of being a key representative for Generation X.
In a weird sort of way, it's almost an echo with what happened with Andrew Wood's death earlier. Not in the sense that the two circumstances are truly tied. They are not. But what you have is a case where a tragic incident is what propels the band to kind of rethink what they're doing. If it's something that's being developed beyond that, the idea that you are a spokesman for a generation, and then one of the only other person who seems to have this role is no longer there and has done so in the most tragic and terrible of ways, his reaction was the idea that now all the more attention gets focused on him, again, as the front man, one person fronting a group of 5 individuals.
I think that Kurt saw a lot of himself in Eddie, and I think vice versa, because they were both sort of people who would just really want to make music and had come from, very difficult backgrounds and who never really intended on becoming rock stars, and then sort of were given this role of being a spokesperson for a generation that they had never really asked for.
It's nothing to strive for. It's actually like this kind of success or trying to fulfill this kind of hype. It can destroy everything. It can destroy what's real, which is like music to you, or what's real, which is your life. It can destroy it. It can make it a commodity. At whose cost? At yours. At your life and, your music. They'll take it all away from you.
What Vedder actually does is try to figure out how to go on making records and being a rock star on his own terms and dictate what the meaning of that is. Because being unable to control that is part of what does Cobain in. So he becomes someone who is very, very controlling of how his records are going to come out, how he's going to talk to the press about them. It would have been a very different thing had he been able to communicate as directly with the audience as a band can now. But, he really couldn't. And it just became this big black hole.
He was absolutely caught right dead center of, what the grunge scene was, and he wasn't really part of that. He was an import. So he had to, it was probably really awful and confusing for him. That must have been really hard. And I felt bad for him. And I remember back in the day, too, he would always complain, like they were on the cover of Newsweek this one month, and it was during a Bosnian War or something. And I remember he was famously saying, why put us on the cover? How could we be more important than that? And it seemed like he wasn't appreciative of his fame.
And so the idea that it's all sort of piling in on Eddie Vedder in particular makes him go like, okay, stop, please, space, hold up, just, stop.
The death of Kurt Cobain had highlighted the tragic effects the pressures of fame can bring. And although the issue was now at the forefront of the industry, it was something that had not been overlooked by Pearl Jam, who are now continuing their apparent withdrawal from the media spotlight. Since late '93, while still on the road for the Versus tour, the band had been hard at work recording their 3rd studio album, Vitalogy, with producer Brendan O'Brien. Finally released in October 1994, it was a distinctly less commercial record and featured a broad mix of styles.
Vitalogy is as close to a perfect album as Pearl Jam made. Certainly, for me, their classic record. And the one where they get the reach of what they can do right. Their ability to go back to not just the metal and grunge that they come up on, but also the music they grew up on. So that means more ballads, more of a classic 60s and 70s rock sound. Vedder, who talks obsessively about The Who, has a voice that invites comparisons more to Jim Morrison than Pete Townsend, and works with a band that stretches out better than The Who did. And both these things are part of Vitalogy.
Once divided, there's nothing left to show try. Some words unspoken can't be taken back. Walks on his own with thoughts he can't help thinking. Futures above, but in the past he's slow and sinking.
It is the moment where you hear him on the radio and think, sure sounds like a rock star to me. You can hear him more clearly, less buried in the mix, less adorned by guitar noise. Those are the kinds of songs they were making then.
All the grunge bands draw upon any wide variety of styles of music. It was not any just one style that they were, I think, aligned to. If you take Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Nirvana, you can't just say, well, all they did was heavy metal or hard rock. There's always folk-type songs. There's Beatles-y type stuff. Pearl Jam in particular even had some funky things, such as the song Animal off of Verses. Has kind of like a funky type guitar riff. That's the thing with Pearl Jam and also the other bands. Their music and their styles, whenever they would try to do a different type of style, it never sounded forced. It sounded very natural. And they were also able to inject their own personality into it and totally make it their own.
Vitalogy sort of sets a kind of a template for Pearl Jam records later. They always had a screamer on there, your sort of your last exits, your Spin the Black Circles. They always had a couple of introspective ballads. Like even when they went out of their way to not write an arena anthem, they still sort of accidentally did with Corduroy because it ended up becoming this pretty big song. And then you get to the back half of it, and it's got these weird sonic experiments that stupid mop song and Bugs, which is, I don't think people give Eddie enough credit for being just one of the weirdest things ever put on a mainstream rock record.
They're kind of experimenting in a way that they hadn't before. Sonically, they're trying different approaches to what a song is. The album cover itself is a great example. It's a very weird kind of entity that stands alone, and it shows Pearl Jam, kind of becoming this artier band.
I mean, look, I never spent a long time trying to figure out what the concept of Vitalogy was. It seemed to have something to say to us about being vital, and it seemed to come packaged in this patina of Americana. They seem to be grappling with what it meant to be an American band at that point. And they really get it right. They really get the past and the present right at the same time. Better than anybody had. Also because most bands recording then weren't really looking further back than the 70s. You know, I mean, if they were paying any homage to their roots, it was a little Zeppelin, a little Black Sabbath, a little Alice Cooper. You know, for Pearl Jam, it went deeper. It really went back to the 60s. You couldn't say it was the whole history of rock because it didn't really go back to Elvis. But it did go back to those glorious 60s moments, 64 to 67, the flowering of rock and roll worldwide. And they meant to, and they were good at it.
I think that if there was a record in their canon that reflected their personality best, it would be Vitalogy, because I think it represents, you know, this band that is really passionate, that is quiet when it needs to be, that knows about melody, is capable of incredible musicianship, is sometimes goofy, is sometimes interested in getting outside of their comfort zone. And I also think lyrically it's a very, very powerful record. I think it's, clearly it's sort of Eddie really getting to the root of the things he's concerned about and the stories he wants to tell.
One key track from Vitalogy, Not For You, focused on the exploitation of music fans by the commercial industry, something that Vedder and the rest of the band felt very strongly about.
I would argue my favorite song by Pearl Jam, still to this day, is actually Not For You. It's a very, very focused song. It is not quite like the other anthems they've already done on their first two albums. It is something that's a slow-burning build. It's incredibly intense. It's something that rises up with dare I say, it flows. It's something that everything about it connects together. It's a very simple song on the face of it, but it's the virtue of simplicity that just keeps going forward. Everything sort of clicks in. You get a sense of Vedder working himself up in a very, very intense way, but the band, too, really locking into something.
The subject matter of Not For You had particular significance, as at the time of Vitalogy's release, Pearl Jam had been embroiled in a dispute with concert agent Ticketmaster after discovering that service charges had been added to the price of their tickets during the Versus tour. The band opted to boycott the company, and their summer tour was cancelled. This was a bold step in an attempt to do the right thing for their fans and to fight the commercial music machine, but it seemed as if Pearl Jam would ultimately take the stand alone.
When I spoke with Eddie for my book Grunge, that he actually talked about that, and it's not as, people make it out to be, well, they just woke up one day and they were like, Ticketmaster sucks, let's just take them on. It wasn't like that at all. It was actually a step-by-step thing. Ticketmaster at the time had a complete monopoly, which they pretty much still do today. They had like surcharges and stuff on their tickets, and there was no clear explanation as to what these surcharges were for. So I think Pearl Jam was the first band to stand up and say, well, what is this about? And they couldn't get a clear answer.
To Pearl Jam's credit, their hearts were absolutely in the right place. They've always, and I think this was really the incident that made them so much about the fans, that they, that they heard that fans were saying these service charges and whatever else, this is all bullshit, and again, it gets in the way of the music. And it's primarily Eddie saying, you know what, you're right, we are going to figure out a way to work around that.
There were a number of other bands that stepped forward and said, yes, we're with you, Pearl Jam, but none of those bands decided that they were only going to tour in non-Ticketmaster venues. Pearl Jam's the only one. Everyone else said, yeah, Ticketmaster's bad, but thank you very much, Pearl Jam, but we're still going to, do business with Ticketmaster. Pearl Jam said no. Ticketmaster, I think the quote is even, Ticketmaster is the enemy.
Unfortunately, they sort of accidentally ended up punishing the fans. It was right when No Code was coming out, and it was going to be their first Ticketmaster free tour, and it was a big deal because they were going to play the East Coast for the first time in several years, and so, and so they ended up, having to book odd cities with strange venues because, they had to get venues that weren't already affiliated with Ticketmaster, and in order to get tickets, you had to call a very strange 800 number, and it was always like very limited. I remember, having all of my friends, calling at exactly the same time, trying to get through for, this sort of very finite number of tickets. And so they ended up making it more difficult to be a fan of the band. So, was it a success? Probably not. I mean, because that tour had all kinds of problems, and I think people ended up being a little bit unhappy. But they certainly gained something from it, and they certainly sort of earned a certain amount of respect, and you can't fault them for for trying. I mean, it's anytime David's going to take on Goliath, you have to root for the underdog.
The situation with Ticketmaster and the stance that Pearl Jam had taken prevented them from playing in the United States for almost 3 years. With the '95 tour for Vitalogy declared a failure, Pearl Jam continued stripping back. As a brief respite from the rigors of running their own act, the band recorded with one of their major influences, Neil Young, on the album Mirrorball. By the summer of 1996, the grunge juggernaut was beginning to show signs of slowing down. Following the demise of Nirvana and Pearl Jam's self-enforced absence from the road, coupled with internal conflict in other major grunge acts such as Soundgarden and a steady rise in pop music, it was clear the landscape was changing. Pearl Jam as a band had grown in many ways, and this became apparent as they released their 4th studio album, No Code, in August that year. A step beyond the work they had completed on Vitalogy, it was more experimental and further away from where they had started with 10. However, it was ultimately deemed inaccessible to a large proportion of their fans, and many began to drift away.
No Code wasn't made to be a commercial blockbuster record. That thing's all there in the title. Do you want to understand it? No, there's no code. You can't break it.
I remember the day the record came out. Pearl Jam at that point was renting a studio that's not too far from where we're sitting. In fact, just 4 or 5 blocks away. Big warehouse, which was Pearl Jam Central. And you went in there and all their guitars were stacked there, and they conducted press interviews in this big warehouse. Previously, you had access to Pearl Jam sort of separately, but now they were big enough that it was kind of like 3 or 4 days of media interviews. And they, I think, wanted the record to be successful, but they already were saying things in interviews with the release of that album that they didn't want it to be as successful as they had been before. It's a very odd thing for a band to say. Most bands put a record out and they say, I want to sell as many copies as I can. You'd never hear Beyonce or Jay-Z say, we only want to sell a couple million, we don't want to sell 10 million. But Pearl Jam were literally saying things like that at that time. So I think they wanted to lower expectations for No Code. It's a disjointed record to a degree. You have other band members now contributing, but that sort of contributes to a lack of cohesion on that album. It's got a few good songs, but it's not my favorite Pearl Jam record, and in fact, it's not in the top 5. And I think most Pearl Jam fans agree, and maybe the band members now agree as well.
No Code is really the height of their experiment with refusal. And it is possible to refuse so much that the audience stops running towards you. Now, mind you, all of their heroes did this as well. Neil Young made records that were spectacularly unsuccessful. The point is that he continued to make whatever records he wanted, and occasionally would come back and make a record that was successful. But it didn't stop him from making whatever records he wanted. And that's their model at this point. we're going to make whatever record we want. We need to do things our way. They're still trying to find their equilibrium in a time of great difficulty, following the death of Cobain, following this extended absence from the road during their battle with Ticketmaster, and really trying to figure out how they can navigate a world that really doesn't want them to do anything they want the way they want to. They had more successful experiments with that than No Code.
With their boycott of Ticketmaster once again preventing Pearl Jam from a full tour in support of No Code, the album failed to achieve the high success of their previous work. Moving into 1997 and returning to the recording studio, it seemed that the band had finally come through their dark period, producing an album that would re-establish their classic rock credentials.
Yield kind of represents the last hurrah for Pearl Jam as this real mainstream commercial act. Mostly because of the success of Given to Fly, which was one of their biggest singles and was the thing that you could not run away from on radio. Although I have a sense that a lot of people bought Yield thinking that it was going to be more in the tenfold, because it has that, because Given to Fly is such like a, it's got the riff from Going to California on it. It's such a sort of a classic sounding, real kind of 70s influence song. I think a lot of people remember Yield as not the album that it actually is, because it is fairly raw and fairly, not quite as kind of loose and jagged as No Code or Vitalogy was, but it's still playing pretty fast and loose with the rules. I would imagine that the reaction to No Code, and especially the reaction to the tour, made them kind of, it's like, well, maybe we need to take a step back a bit. Maybe we need to think about it a little bit more and reset a bit.
To me, Yield is a Pearl Jam record, and it's a Pearl Jam record in between records in which they don't want to sound so much like Pearl Jam, in between much more experimental records where they're trying to find their way. Yield is the record where they're now going to return to the road, and as if to celebrate it, they make the kind of record that made them famous. I actually think it's quite a good record, notable as their records so often are for the ballads rather than for the harder songs. But the specific meaning of the title, part of it is they want to give up and get back on the road. That's the point of it being named for a traffic sign and having a traffic sign on the cover of the record. We want to go back on tour. And if that means we have to yield to this touring machinery governed by the Death Star called Ticketmaster, okay, we're back.
Yield marked a return to form for the Seattle five-piece, as it received critical success and a strong commercial position. In the courts, Pearl Jam had failed to win their case against Ticketmaster and finally relented, returning for a full tour, during which drummer Jack Irons withdrew from the band to be replaced by former Soundgarden member Matt Cameron. Moving into the 21st century, Pearl Jam's place in rock music had been firmly cemented. Experimental album Binaural was regarded as a release for the true Pearl Jam fan, along with 2002's Riot Act, while their self-titled Pearl Jam album in 2006 and most recent release Backspacer were considered strong demonstrations of classic rock.
In the 21st century, I think by the time you get to Binaural and by the time you get to the 112 or whatever it was bootlegs that they put out themselves from that gigantic tour that they went on around the world, I think by then Pearl Jam definitely knows who they are, what their role is, and who their fans are. And that's around the time when they reinvent themselves as this kind of always-on-the-road workhorse.
By binaural, then you're dealing with the hardcore Pearl Jam audience. And you're also dealing with fans that, are going to see every Pearl Jam concert. They become almost like the Grateful Dead for this group of people. I think there's a significant number of Pearl Jam's audience today that are people that are former Deadheads. And the reasons for that is that Pearl Jam's live concerts are always exciting. They're always cultural events that kind of are more than just a concert. They're a band that never play the same thing twice in a row, and they care a lot for their fans.
Questa notte la nostra songlist sarà un po' diversa. Speriamo che vi piaccia. In un periodo di guerra canteremo canzoni che parlano dell'importanza della pace.
Binaural has a very specific sound. It's the one time Pearl Jam decided to make a headphones record, which is strange for a live band, but but there's some stuff that works. And then Riot Act, there's sort of these, when they start to become a kind of more of a political band, they've always sort of been socially conscious throughout their entire career, but I think that they'd never written anything as sort of direct as Bush Leaguer. By the time you get to that self-titled record in 2006, I love that album was self-titled because that is what a Pearl Jam album sounds like, and this is what it is, and this is what it's going to be, and if you don't like it, move on, check in with us next time, whatever. But if you do, this is what you're going to get, and these are the layers that you're going to get, and this is the commitment that you're going to get.
For 2009's Backspacer, Pearl Jam moved away from their contract with Sony and set up their own Monkey Wrench label, on which the album was released.
The paradigm within the music industry shifted, and suddenly Pearl Jam were no longer beholden to Epic Records. They then could go out and release records themselves. They could do that whenever they wanted, and they began to make these deals where they had a one-off with the label. We're going to release an album, we're going to put it out, and they totally ran the show themselves.
We have a case where a band fulfills its own major label contract and is able to pull the ripcord and walk away without a care in the world. Sony asked them, please, we'd love to have you stay. They realize they've got a steady catalog selling band, and the band goes like, nope, don't need to anymore. And they didn't. They're able to record albums and release them at the pace they want to do. They're able to pursue all the various side projects they want to do as well, that Stone Gossard has with Brad and Satchel. You had Jeff Ament doing Three Fish. You have Eddie Vedder famously doing the Dead Man Walking soundtrack, and then finally with Into the Wild, his first full-on solo album right there. And then you have all sorts of other projects and all sorts of other things happening. And then you have them living life. You have them, you know, married, kids, family. You have the classic sort of cycle, you know, other interests, other things in life come to the fore. You look at Backspacer and you look at a band that was able to have a #1 record well into its career. You're looking at a band that became kind of the negative label that was placed on it. Oh, they're just a bunch of classic rock, you know, types and all that. Well, they have become a classic rock band. They have become a band that people look at now and go like, yeah, you know, there's them. They're still out there doing their thing.
When something's old, let me shed a little light on it. When something's cold, let me put a little fire on it. If something's old, I wanna put a bit of shine on it. When something's cold, I wanna fight to get it back again. Yeah, 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 yeah. Fight to get it back again. Yeah.
I think the most recent record is really a return to form. It's got some great songs. They're all very short. They're all very energetic. It's not a record of anthems. And yet the Fixer, you know, kind of has an anthematic Who sound, but it's not long, stretched out anthematic choruses. The contrast of that artistically with the songs on Versus or 10 is remarkable. I think Pearl Jam is a band that, to use a wizened old sawhorse of a metaphor, they're like a wine. They've matured, and as time has gone by, it's a richer taste.
Looking back now on Pearl Jam, we're looking at a band that is coming up on its 20th anniversary from its first formal release. So we're talking about a literal generation, that there could be somebody out there into the band or enjoying them now who was born when the album was released, who was born when the band first played together.
There is no other grunge band that still exists. There are no other bands from Seattle in the 90s. Zero. When Eddie Vedder stands on stage and sings, you know, he's a guy who's laying claim to a tradition. The tradition he talks about is Pete Townsend. The guy he sounds like is Jim Morrison. The guy they recorded with as a backing band is Neil Young. Those bands aren't going to be here forever. And Pearl Jam comes along at a particular point, 20 years on. They meant to take the torch, and they took it.
Even though the scene that Pearl Jam sprang from has long since diminished, they have managed to endure the roller coaster ride of the 90s, and their classic rock edge has allowed them to maintain a strong fan base and still feel relevant today. As they move through the 21st century, Pearl Jam are comfortably at the top of their game, proving that you don't have to burn out and you don't have to fade away.